In the spring of 1945, as Soviet shells rained down on Berlin, and the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash, a handful of women stood at the very center of history's most infamous regime. They had dined in castles built on stolen fortunes. They had raised children who called Adolf Hitler Uncle Wolf. They had worn jewels looted from the wardrobes of the murdered, and they had smiled for propaganda cameras as symbols of ideal German motherhood. And then, in a matter of days, their husbands were dead, disgraced, or standing trial for crimes that would define the 20th century. What happened next is a story almost nobody tells. Some of these women went to prison. Some inherited fortunes their lawyers fought for decades to keep. Some children grew up to renounce everything their fathers stood for, and others spent their entire lives defending monsters. Remarkably, several of these children were still alive within the last few years, quietly carrying surnames that once made the world tremble, appearing in interviews, court filings, and in at least one horrifying instance, choosing not to survive the regime's collapse at all. Some of these women faced Allied tribunals and prison cells. Others spent the rest of their lives in luxury villas, fighting court battles to reclaim fortunes built on plunder. Their children split into two irreconcilable camps, those who spent decades defending their father's crimes, and those who fled so far from that legacy they built entirely new identities. This is the untold story of the women behind the swastika, and the astonishing, often tragic afterlives of the families the Third Reich left behind. To understand what became of these women, you first have to understand the strange, gilded world they inhabited. Nazi ideology publicly worshipped the traditional German family. Women were told their purpose was Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, while state propaganda plastered the image of the fertile, devoted Hausfrau across magazines and newsreels. Yet behind the closed doors of the Reich's inner sanctum, on the mountainside retreat of the Obersalzberg above Berchtesgaden, a very different reality unfolded. Hitler surrounded himself with a court of powerful men and their wives, mistresses, and children, all living in a bubble of extraordinary privilege paid for by a totalitarian state. Affairs, common. Mistresses were tolerated, even institutionalized. The men who publicly preached moral purity often lived lives of open hypocrisy. It was, in essence, a royal court, complete with rivalries, favorites, and unspoken rules about who could be seen at Hitler's table and who could not. And like every royal court in history, when the king fell, everyone around him fell too. Nowhere was that court's intimacy more visible than in the Braun family. Eva Braun, Hitler's long-term companion, had a younger sister named Gretel, who over the years became deeply embedded in the Nazi elite's social circle. In June 1944, just 3 days before Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Gretel married Hermann Fegelein, an ambitious SS cavalry officer who served as Himmler's liaison to Hitler's headquarters. The wedding was a study in the regime's theatrical self-importance. A ceremony at the Burg Gardens with Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann standing as witnesses, followed by a celebratory breakfast at the Eagle's Nest, Hitler's mountaintop retreat carved into the rock of Berchtesgaden. For a brief moment, as the Allies prepared their invasion of France, the Nazi elite paused to celebrate a wedding as though the war were background noise. That illusion would not last. By April 1945, with the Red Army encircling Berlin, Fegelein made a decision that would cost him everything. He fled Hitler's bunker without permission, apparently attempting to escape the doomed city. He was found, brought back, and accused of desertion, a charge made even more damning by the timing. Heinrich Himmler, Fegelein's own superior and the man who had stood as witness at his wedding, had just been discovered secretly negotiating surrender with the Western Allies, betraying Hitler in the regime's final hours. Furious and paranoid, and reportedly pushed further by Bormann, Hitler ordered Fegelein executed. He was shot in the Reich Chancellery Garden on the 28th of April, 1945, despite, according to several accounts, desperate pleas from Eva Braun on her brother-in-law's behalf. Barely 24 hours later, Hitler married Eva in the bunker, making the newly widowed Gretel, extraordinarily, Hitler's sister-in-law for less than 48 hours before his suicide. Gretel herself had remained on the Obersalzberg, pregnant with Fegelein's child, unaware her husband had already been executed. On the 5th of May 1945, a week after Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives in the bunker, Gretel gave birth to a daughter. She named the baby Eva, after her sister. It is a haunting detail, a child born into the ashes of the regime, named for a woman who had died by suicide alongside history's most reviled dictator. But the story of this family does not end there. Hidden away at Fischhorn Castle in Austria, headquarters of Fehlding's old SS cavalry division, was a private trove of photographs, home film reels, jewelry, and personal letters, some reportedly exchanged between Hitler and Eva Braun herself. According to post-war accounts, an American counterintelligence agent posing as a refugee gained Gretel's trust and persuaded her to reveal the hiding place. The material was seized and shipped to Washington. Some of it has never been made public. To this day, historians still debate exactly what survived, what was destroyed, and what remains locked away in archives beyond public view. Gretel's later life was marked by quiet tragedy. She remarried in the 1950s, but her daughter Eva never recovered from the shadow of her birth. In 1971, at just 26 years old, Eva Fejdling took her own life after the death of her fiancé in a car accident. Gretel herself developed Alzheimer's disease in her later years and died in Bavaria in 1987. It is a sobering coda to a wedding that once seemed like the height of Nazi glamour, a reminder that the human cost of this history rippled forward for generations, often landing hardest on those who had no say in the choices that shaped their lives. No family's story from those final bunker days is more harrowing, however, than that of Joseph and Magda Goebbels. Magda had been briefly and unsuccessfully courted by Hitler himself years earlier, before marrying his propaganda minister in 1931. Together they had 6 children: Helga, Hild, Helmut, Holde, and Heide, all given names deliberately beginning with the letter H, a quiet tribute to the Führer they idolized. Photographed constantly for Nazi propaganda as the ideal German family, the Goebbels children became, in effect, the regime's most photogenic advertisement. Magda also had an older son, Harold Quandt, from a previous marriage to industrialist Gunther Quandt, who by 1945 was serving as a Luftwaffe officer and had been captured as a prisoner of war in North Africa, a stroke of fortune that placed him, unknowingly, outside the catastrophe about to consume the rest of his family. As Berlin fell in the final days of April 1945, Magda made the decision to bring her 6 younger children to Hitler's bunker rather than send them to safety, believing, by her own later written words, that a world without National Socialism was not a world fit for them to inhabit. On the 1st of May 1945, the day after Hitler's own suicide, Magda and a doctor administered morphine to sedate the children before crushing cyanide capsules into their mouths, killing all 6. She and Joseph Goebbels then went into the Chancellery Garden, where they too took their own lives. It remains one of the single most disturbing acts of the entire war: 6 children, the eldest only 12, murdered by their own mother, rather than allowed to grow up in a defeated Germany. Historians still debate how much agency, if any, Magda's husband exercised in that final decision, and whether her devotion to Hitler had, by that point, entirely eclipsed her instincts as a mother. Harold Quandt, the one child who survived, went on to inherit a share of his biological father's industrial fortune, becoming a major shareholder in what would eventually grow into the modern BMW automotive empire, meaning that, remarkably, a direct line from Magda Goebbels' family still echoes through one of the wealthiest industrial families in Germany today. If the Braun family's story was one of intimacy and secrecy, the Himmler household reveals something darker still: the sheer hypocrisy at the top of the Nazi state. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS, married a nurse named Margarete in 1928. The marriage produced one daughter, Gudrun, born in 1929, and the couple later adopted a son. But by the late 1930s, Himmler, the very man who demanded rigid moral discipline from his SS officers, had begun a secret affair with his secretary, Hedwig Pothest, a woman more than a decade his junior. Unwilling to divorce his wife, but equally unwilling to end the affair, Himmler simply maintained both households, fathering 2 more children with Pothest while his wife remained publicly unaware of the full extent of the betrayal, even as she worked for the German Red Cross throughout the war. When the war ended, this fractured family scattered in different directions, each member facing Allied interrogators who wanted answers about the man responsible for the machinery of genocide. Marguerite and young Gudrun fled north into Italy, only to be captured by American forces and shuttled through a series of internment camps before eventually being brought to Nuremberg to testify. For Gudrun, still a teenager, the experience did not produce remorse. It produced the opposite. She emerged from the trials as one of the most fiercely loyal defenders of her father's memory in post-war Germany, a stance she would maintain for the rest of her long life. She later became active in far-right political circles and helped run an organization called Still Hilfe, Silent Help, which quietly supported former SS officers and war criminals, some of them men responsible for horrific atrocities, well into her old age. Gudrun Himmler died in Munich in 2018, at 88 years old, having spent nearly 7 decades as an unrepentant symbol of Nazi nostalgia. Her mother, Margrethe, by contrast, spent her post-war years fighting a humiliating denazification process, stripped of her pension and voting rights, before dying in 1967. Himmler's mistress, Hedwig Pothast, faded into a quieter obscurity, living for decades under a different name and dying in Baden-Baden in 1994. Their children's fates diverged sharply, proof that even within a single fractured family, history's judgment did not fall evenly. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful men in the collapsing Reich, presided over a household that the regime held up as a model of Nazi fertility. He and his wife Gerda had 10 children between 1930 and 1943, several of them named after their godparents, including a son named after Adolf Hitler himself, who stood as godfather. But the Bormann marriage concealed a disturbing arrangement. Bormann was serially unfaithful, and rather than divorcing him, Gerda reportedly embraced the idea that a man of importance to the Reich should be permitted parallel marriages to produce more children for the state, a chilling illustration of how deeply Nazi ideology had colonized even personal relationships. Bormann vanished during a chaotic breakout attempt from the bunker complex in the first days of May 1945, and for decades his ultimate fate remained one of the war's enduring mysteries, fueling rumors that he had escaped to South America. It would take until the 1970s and the eventual discovery of remains in Berlin for forensic science to confirm he had, in fact, died attempting to flee the city. Gerda Bormann did not live to see any resolution to her husband's disappearance. She fled with her children to a mountain village near Bolzano in Italy, where Allied forces arrested her. During her interrogation, doctors discovered she was suffering from advanced uterine cancer. She died in a hospital in April 1946, only 37 years old, leaving her 10 surviving children essentially parentless in a defeated, ruined country. What happened to them next is one of the more unexpectedly moving chapters in this entire history. The children were taken in and raised largely outside the shadow of their father's crimes, several under Catholic care. In perhaps the most remarkable twist, Bormann's eldest son, also named Martin, went on to become a Roman Catholic priest, spending years as a missionary before eventually leaving the priesthood, marrying a former nun, and living a private life until his death in 2013. It is a genuinely extraordinary transformation. The son of one of the architects of the Nazi state's inner machinery, choosing a life devoted to the faith his father's regime had tried to subordinate to its own ideology. Several of Bormann's children are believed to still be alive today, living quiet, largely anonymous lives, a stark contrast to Gudrun Himmler's public defiance. Not every fallen Nazi wife stayed loyal once the cameras stopped rolling. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister throughout the 1930s, had married Annelies Henkel, heiress to a wealthy German wine and champagne-producing family, in 1920. Contemporaries described her as strong-willed and politically ambitious. Some historians argue it was actually Annelies who pushed her husband toward the Nazi Party in the first place, eager to see him rise in influence. As the war turned catastrophically against Germany, Ribbentrop's diplomatic relevance evaporated, and by the war's final days, he had effectively abandoned his family, fleeing to Hamburg where British special forces eventually tracked him down hiding in a shabby apartment. He was tried and hanged at Nuremberg. Annelies, meanwhile, was interned at the site of the former Dachau concentration camp, a bitter irony that seems almost too pointed to be true, yet is well documented. She spent the rest of her life fighting the Allies in court to preserve her family's fortune and writing books defending her husband's legacy, dying unrepentant in 1973. Her son Rudolf von Ribbentrop, however, took an entirely different path during the war itself, becoming a highly decorated Waffen-SS officer who was wounded multiple times in combat and survived to the remarkable age of 98, passing away only in 2019, meaning a son of Hitler's foreign minister was alive and giving interviews well into the 21st century. Several of his siblings, in fact, lived into their late 80s and 90s, an unsettling reminder of just how recently these events actually occurred. But if you want to understand the single most emblematic Nazi power couple, look no further than Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, and after Rudolf Hess's bizarre flight to Scotland in 1941, officially named Hitler's designated successor. Göring's first wife, a Swedish noblewoman named Karin, had died of heart failure in 1931, and Göring never fully let her go. He named his sprawling country estate outside Berlin, Karinhall, in her memory, and even had her remains reinterred there before ordering the estate destroyed as Soviet troops approached in 1945. In 1935, Göring married the actress Emmy Göring in a lavish state wedding, and in 1938 the couple had a daughter, named after the daughter of Mussolini's foreign minister. Emmy quickly became known as the unofficial First Lady of the Reich, presiding over a lifestyle of staggering, looted opulence, art stolen from Jewish collectors, palatial hunting lodges, and a 50-meter replica palace built for Edda's amusement and paid for by the German Air Force. Unlike almost every other man in Hitler's inner circle, Göring reportedly remained faithful to Emmy throughout their marriage, a strange footnote of domestic loyalty inside a regime built on betrayal at every other level. Yet the glittering Göring household could not escape the collapse closing in around it. As Allied bombing crippled German cities and the Luftwaffe's failures became impossible to hide, Göring's standing with Hitler crumbled. In the war's final week, believing Hitler incapacitated in his bunker, Göring made a fateful attempt to assume leadership of the collapsing Reich, a move Bormann seized upon to convince Hitler his old deputy was committing treason. Göring was stripped of his titles and placed under house arrest with his family at the Obersalzberg, narrowly surviving a devastating RAF bombing before being moved for his own safety. In the war's dying days, he attempted to reach American lines, hoping almost unbelievably that he might personally negotiate Germany's surrender with General Eisenhower. Instead, he and his family were captured by an American intelligence unit and eventually transferred toward Allied custody, his fate about to be decided not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom. Göring became the most prominent defendant at the Nuremberg trials, defiant and unrepentant to the very end, using the witness stand to spar intellectually with Allied prosecutors in a performance that unsettled even his captors. Sentenced to death, he cheated the gallows entirely, smuggling a concealed cyanide capsule into his cell and taking his own life the night before his scheduled execution. A final act of defiance that shocked the world and remains debated by historians to this day over exactly how he managed to hide the poison. Emmy Göring, meanwhile, was convicted during the denazification process and served roughly a year in prison, losing a substantial portion of the family's remaining property. She and Edda rebuilt a modest life together, and Emmy eventually published a memoir defending her husband before her death in 1973. Edda herself never married, training instead as a lawyer, though she spent years fighting, ultimately without success, to reclaim compensation for her father's confiscated estate. In a strange twist connecting one Nazi scandal to a future one, Edda later became romantically involved with the German journalist Gerd Heidemann, the very man who would go on to discover, and later be exposed for fabricating, the infamous Hitler Diaries hoax of the early 1980s. Edda Göring died in 2018, at 80 years old, having spent her entire life defending her father's memory, just as Gudrun Himmler had done for hers, the two women dying within months of each other, closing out an era that had refused to fully end for over 70 years. Not every marriage in Hitler's inner circle ended in a courtroom hanging or a cyanide capsule. Albert Speer, the regime's armaments minister and one of the few defendants at Nuremberg to express any public contrition, had married his wife Margarete in 1928, long before he rose to prominence. Unlike Emmy Göring or Annelies von Ribbentrop, Margarete Speer largely avoided the public spotlight both during the war and after it, when her husband was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison rather than death. A verdict that stunned many observers given his central role in exploiting slave labor for the war economy. She waited, raised their 6 children largely alone, and remained married to him until his death in 1981. Speer's post-war reinvention as the supposedly repentant Nazi, detailed in his best-selling memoirs, has been challenged by later historians who uncovered evidence that he knew far more about the Holocaust than he ever publicly admitted. His family's relative quiet compared to the Himmlers and Görings illustrates just how differently these post-war legacies could unfold depending on whether a family chose defiance, silence, or reinvention. Taken together, these intertwined family histories tell us something essential about how the Third Reich actually functioned, not merely as a system of tanks, laws, and armies, but as an intensely personal network of loyalty, favoritism, and hypocrisy that extended into bedrooms, nurseries, and wedding ceremonies. The regime that publicly demanded rigid sexual and moral conformity from ordinary Germans was at its very top, riddled with mistresses, secret second families, and arrangements its own leaders would have condemned in anyone else. And the post-war fates of these women reveal the deep unevenness of justice after 1945. Some, like Emmy Göring and Margarete Himmler, faced formal denazification proceedings, prison terms, and the loss of their wealth and status. Others, like Annelies von Ribbentrop, fought the legal system for decades and largely preserved their fortunes while never renouncing their husbands' crimes. And the children, many of them entirely innocent of anything beyond the circumstances of their birth, split into two haunting categories: those who spent their lives as unrepentant custodians of their father's legacies, quietly aiding fugitive war criminals through networks like Stillhilfe, and those who fled from the association entirely, seeking redemption in the priesthood, in professional obscurity, or simply in silence. What makes this history so unsettling today is not just its cruelty, but its recency. Several children of Hitler's inner circle lived long enough to be interviewed on camera, to publish memoirs, to attend reunions of former SS officers, or to die only within the last decade. Rudolf von Ribbentrop was alive until 2019. Gudrun Himmler, Eva Göring both died in 2018. This is not ancient history confined to black and white newsreels. It is a story whose final chapters are still closing within living memory, and whose unresolved questions, from the missing Hitler letters at Fishhorn Castle to the precise mechanics of Göring's final act of defiance, continue to occupy historians and archivists to this day. Historians continue returning to these family stories because they complicate the comfortable myth that evil announces itself plainly. The men who orchestrated genocide also hosted wedding breakfasts, doted on daughters, and maintained, in their own minds, ordinary domestic lives. Understanding how ordinary-seeming family structures, marriages, mistresses, children's birthdays, coexisted with the machinery of the Holocaust forces us with an uncomfortable truth. Monstrous ideology does not monstrous-looking people to sustain it, and the human capacity for denial, loyalty, and self-justification can outlast the regime that created it by 70 years or more. The women and children left behind in the rubble of 1945 remind us that history's reckonings are rarely clean, rarely complete, and rarely finished within a single generation. Archivists still comb through sealed files in Washington and Koblenz, hoping to confirm exactly what survived from Fishhorn Castle, while genealogists and journalists continue tracking down surviving grandchildren who, for the most part, have chosen silence over spectacle. Every few years, another interview surfaces, another memoir is published, another court battle over restitution reopens old wounds, proof that the legal, financial, and moral reckoning of the Third Reich never received a clean final chapter. For modern audiences, the lesson is not simply that evil can wear a wedding ring or host a child's birthday party. It is that entire families, entire generations can be shaped, and in some tragic cases destroyed, by the choices of a single man convinced of his own righteousness, and that the ripple effects of extremism rarely end when the ideology's leader does. That, perhaps, is the most sobering legacy of all, that the fall of the Third Reich did not end its story, but simply passed it on to the next generation to carry, defend, or quietly try to forget.